This is Lilies, Quietus of the Nights, an interesting name. This is a 2D Metroidvania going for a very dark fantasy style that just released into early access a couple of days ago. And the first thing to notice is the art style. I did mention dark fantasy. It's going for this really interesting mix of art styles, with the main character and some of the other characters having an almost anime-esque art style, but the actual world design, all of the enemies and bosses and things, having a very kind of dark, twisted fairy tale-ish art style. So it makes an interesting meld between the sort of non-combat character that you play and all of the stuff that's happening around them being really twisted and grotesque and dark. And it's going for a very mysterious world, an almost like Hollow Knight or Dark Souls-esque presentation of the world in which something very bad has happened, but you are sort of slowly piecing together exactly what, and everything is just very dark and forlorn and gross and kind of forgotten. So the whole world you're in is very much decaying and has a big air of mystery about it, and you're trying to figure out what exactly has happened and who you are. You are playing as someone who is related to these priestesses that seem to have been popular when the world was right in the middle of its fall, and now you sort of wake up in a mysterious place without too much memory of exactly what's going on. So it goes for the piece things together with boss descriptions and all that as far as its lore goes, which I'm always a big fan of. And the fact that you're a non-combat character is interesting because you don't actually do any of the fighting yourself exactly. You are clearly just like a little girl, basically, that's not really meant to be here, and instead you use these spirits to fight for you. And it actually reminds me of sort of a combination of something like Castlevania Aria of Sorrow and an early PS3 game called Folklore, which I can't even believe I'm referencing right now because I'm pretty sure like almost no one in the world played that, but it was actually really neat. It was a fun game, and it reminds me of those games because they're all about, you know, capturing the spirits slash souls of your enemies and using them as the weapons. And in the case of Folklore, that's what it reminds me of the most, because one of the characters you play as in that game is also a non-combat person that doesn't really do any of the fighting themselves. They're not really meant for it, so they summon up all of these minions to do it for them. And that's exactly what you do here, and all of the animations and stuff are really good because it shows that your character doesn't really know what she's doing in terms of combat and isn't really very good at it. Your dodge roll is not even a dodge roll, it's like a panicked jump forward, and it's actually really terrible, but it works well as a dodge. It's not terrible as in like it's a bad dodge, it works just fine. It just looks funny, and it reminds me of something like Shadow of the Colossus, where Wonder's sword swings are awful because he's not a warrior, so it's specifically designed to show you that he doesn't know what he's doing, and his sword swings are really awkward and terrible. But it doesn't negatively affect the gameplay, it's just like a character building thing, and that's exactly the case with the dodge here. She just like jumps forward into panic instead of like using a more practiced like knightly dodge roll, which is funny. And something to mention is it's not quite like an Aria of Sorrow or Folklore setup where pretty much every enemy has like a soul that you can capture. Instead, all of these spirits that you actually employ for your offense and defense and everything are mostly bosses and mini-bosses. Every individual enemy isn't capturable. They are people that you purify, and they tend to be the big encounters and stuff. Not every single enemy can be used as a spirit. And as you're seeing right now in the background, the environment art for this game is really pretty. It's all really well done, like hand-drawn 2D artwork. As I mentioned, the animations for the enemies, the bosses, and your character and all of the various spirit attacks are really good, and there are really pretty reflections and lots of sort of magical glow all over the place, and it lends this very decayed, twisted world a very sort of serene, pretty, forgotten vibe that I'm always a huge fan of. It's one of my favorite aspects of games like Dark Souls and Hollow Knight, having that sort of abandoned world where something horrible happened, but is also still very pretty in its own way, and that's definitely, they've succeeded in going for that sort of idea here with this world. And the way the combat works is you can equip two different sets of 3 spirits. You have a main attack as well as 2 sort of sub-attacks, and most of your main attacks are infinite use because they're melee attacks, so you summon up one of the various spirits with a melee weapon to attack for you, like the basic knight that you start with, who's a really cool looking character. He kind of looks like he belongs in Darkest Dungeon or something like that, and has a nice solid set of sword swings. You also eventually fight a large mace-wielding sort of knight captain boss, and eventually you can use his attacks as well. They're very slow, but they hit really hard and tend to throw enemies back really far. And you eventually also, once you beat this particular boss you're seeing in the background right now, will get a ranged main attack that you can use, which is very useful, especially for some other sections like underwater sections. And then the sub-spirits tend to be the other bosses and mini-bosses, and the interesting thing about this is they do have an actual use limit. They have a certain number of uses, and once you run out, you are reliant entirely on your melee attacks, so you do have to be a little bit careful about how you use them. Different spirits have a different number of uses, and although most of the main spirits are infinite use, some of them, I've discovered, are not, including this one in particular. Her projectile, she has a lot of uses, but it's not infinite, so that makes the exploration based around these resting points, because every time you rest, all the enemies respawn, and you get all of the charges of your abilities back. There are also these flowers you can find, these red flowers that will restore all of the uses of your equipped spirit set when you find them, but they're pretty rare, so you can't rely on finding tons of those and having a bunch of extra uses. This makes the strategy in the combat pretty fun because, as is traditional with a Metroidvania, every enemy type has their own sorts of gimmicks and attacks that you have to be aware of, and depending on what specific set of spirits you have equipped and what actual sort of character build you want to go for, you might be fighting them in different ways, and you have to worry about this sort of break meter that they have to stun them, and you can even deplete it in time with some of their attacks to interrupt their attacks, which is really useful for some of the bigger enemies to interrupt some sort of big thing that they're about to do that you really don't want them to do. And as you can see right now, there's also some underwater combat, and I do have a bit of a problem with the underwater combat because you can't move very fast underwater, which is fine because you're underwater, but you also can't dodge when you're underwater, which makes some of the underwater enemies really annoying to fight because they have pretty fast charging attacks and you can't dodge out of the way. So the underwater combat is actually kind of difficult because you just can't move very fast, and it feels like you're almost forced to take damage sometimes because stuff just moves a lot quicker than you can, and without a dodge, you can't really get out of the way in time. So I would like to see some sort of underwater dodge capability added at some point in the future. But yeah, aside from all that, you will equip 6 different spirits, or 2 sets of similar spirits, it's all up to you, and you will go through the various areas, defeating all kinds of enemies and finding extra secrets and mini-bosses and boss fights and everything. You've also got a sort of Estus-like charge-based healing system, where you get 3 prayers, and 1 prayer restores a large boost of health after a short delay, so as is traditional with this sort of mechanic in a boss fight, you have to be able to see a good opening to heal because you have to sit still for a second to do it. You can't just do it while moving around with no penalty. So you do have to take a little bit of time to make sure you do it right, although it's not quite as time-consuming as something like Hollow Knight's heal, where you have to sit still and charge for like a good second and a half for like each health point. It's a little bit quicker than that, but it's still something that you have to be careful about using in the right place, which is fun. I enjoy mechanics like that. And you get 3 of these prayer charges, and of course they do restore every time you rest at a bench or bed or any of the rest points. And just like those red flowers that restore the charges of your skills, you can also find the very rare white flowers that will restore 1 prayer charge. Often in larger areas before mini-boss fights and things, you'll find those. Now, the areas themselves are really varied and have entirely different sets of enemies and everything as you would expect for a Metroidvania to have. They're really well developed, actually, and this is one of the things that I want to praise the early access for, because this is something I've mentioned before in other videos about early access games, and it is the way that I personally prefer games like this to do their early access campaigns, is instead of having a large selection of the world available at once, but having a lot of it feel unfinished, instead they have a fewer number of levels, but the levels all feel a lot more populated with stuff to do. I prefer it that way. It's okay, in my opinion, to have fewer areas available at the beginning of your early access period if they all feel a lot more fleshed out, because having a whole bunch of the world technically able to be explored but not really have anything to find in most of it yet doesn't really add gameplay to me, and I'm okay with having less areas if they all feel pretty much finished. I think that's a much better way to actually introduce new areas into your early access game, is to pretty much finish them first, which leads to a slower introduction of new areas, but also leads to always having stuff to do in them, making them worth exploring. It also gives people a much better idea of what your design is going to be like and what your goals with the areas are, because they'll each feel pretty finished, so you can get a good idea early on of if this is a game that's going to be for you, if the area design of the game is something that you're going to enjoy. And for me, it definitely is, because the areas feel like really nice, proper Metroidvania areas with lots of large, open combat arenas and branching paths, secrets to find, hidden walls, mini-bosses, and of course big boss encounters at the end. They all feel very well fleshed out, and of all the areas that are currently in the game, none of them feel like they need a significant amount of extra stuff. None of them feel unfinished. There are also a couple of upgrade systems in the game, although you can only get a glimpse at some of them right now because of the early state, one of which is an enhancement system for these spirits. You can find these 3 different resources that allow you to enhance each spirit, and different spirits might take a different amount of different resources. It sort of depends on the exact type that it is. And enhancing them through the various levels adds all sorts of things to them. It can add anything from the simple make it do more damage to make it fire more projectiles, or make it have like an extra chain in its combo attack and things like that. So it actually makes the upgrades very much worth seeking out, because they drastically increase the power of these skills, as well as adding all sorts of extra new things, like, you know, having them fire 3 projectiles instead of 1, or having them be like a 4 or 5 hit combo instead of a 3 hit combo, and things like that. So it makes a big noticeable difference when you upgrade. And then there are the relics that you'll find in some dead-end areas that are a bit hard to find, and of course some chests that are difficult to get to, things that you would expect. And these are large passive benefits that you have to get these capacity points to actually equip. Different relics will take a different amount of points, and these are usually pretty powerful, like the one you're seeing right now, the Giant's Ring, which gives you more damage from attacks when you're actually on the ground rather than aerial attacks or aquatic attacks. And there are several different relics that are currently in the game that enhance things like that, so that's always cool because it adds a bit of extra character build variety and allows you to fine-tune your build and your spirit set and things to a certain idea. And in fact, there are even some spirits that do different attacks if you are in the water or in the air. For instance, the second spirit you get a hold of after the first big boss is a sort of flail-using character that does a big sweeping area attack around you, but if you use it in the air or in the water, she instead does like this sort of diagonally rising, swinging attack that hits a bunch of times and does a bunch of damage to the break gauges of enemies, allowing you to stun them or knock them out of the air a lot easier. So I think it's really cool that certain spirits have different uses or some sort of extra feature that they do depending on how you use them, and I think that this will make for a pretty varied full game once there's a lot more to it. There are a lot more areas and things, because the areas are already very different feeling, and all the bosses and mini-bosses feel really good. The boss fights are fun. They're pretty much all multi-phase, which makes them really enjoyable, and some of them are quite challenging as well. And when you combine all of that with all the relics and the upgrades and the different spirits you can get, I can see that the full version of the game is probably going to have quite a lot to actually customize your character with, which is always really cool. And the final thing to note definitely is the music. The music in this game is beautiful. It is really pretty, and it matches the sort of grim, forlorn, fairy tale-like aesthetic of the game. It's actually made by a Japanese band called Melee, I believe, who have done some things for some other games like Quietus and Demo. You may recognize their name from games like that, as well as some anime stuff, like some Ghost in the Shell stuff for the newer series, and even Goblin Slayer, actually, they did the opening for that. So the music has a lot of piano and some very sort of relaxing, wanderlusty vocals here and there that are really pretty. The music is just great, and I actually hope that there's some sort of soundtrack released for this at some point, because I would like to have the music separately. It's all really pretty, and definitely improves the atmosphere of the game. It matches it like 1-to-1. It's really nice. So that is a current look at the early access state of Ender Lilies as it has just released. It's a really exciting game, actually, because it shows a lot of competence and a lot of handmade hard work in the art style, the music, the balance, and everything. It's all really solid, actually, and I'm excited to see where it goes from here. So if you want to take a look at the early access page yourself, the link will be in the description below this video to the Steam store page. Just wishlist it if you want to keep an eye on it. It helps you keep an eye on the updates as they roll in, and it also helps to support the developer, and you don't necessarily have to buy it yet if you're not sure. So it's a really good option to actually try out. Thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below, and I'll see you guys next time.